Hello and welcome to Talk About Jesus. Taco About Jesus.
Tacos.
Yeah. I hope you're having a good Taco Tuesday. And also, I hope that your Palm Sunday was wonderful.
Today, we are really excited about the fact that we are actually talking about Esther. We're actually getting into the Bible study of Esther today.
Chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah, chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah, so a kind of interesting thing about the book of Esther is it's broken down into about 3 segments. So chapters 1 and 2 is going over kind of setting up the whole story, figuring out what's actually going on, who's who. Not to give too many things away, but chapter 3 through 5 is going to be where it gets down into the dark side of the story. And then chapters 6 through 10 is where we start seeing the culmination of all the characters and seeing how it actually plays through.
And before we get started, really, I wanted to make a couple notes. So, if you haven't already seen our Esther the background video, go watch it because it covers things. It covers history, prophecy, and biblical archaeology to support the eyewitness testimony of Esther. Usually they say, well, we don't find anything about Esther in archaeological stuff herself. This is called an argument from silence. But usually when these arguments from silence are posed against the Bible, they are horrendously wrong. Some other arguments from silence that have been proven false, right? They say these things aren't real, they never existed, the Bible said they did. And then we found evidence for them. The existence of Hittites, the existence of Sodom, which was discovered in 2015, the existence of Jericho, which was kind of the late 1980s, David as a whole, and then lots of little tidbits of evidence for the Exodus. If you're interested in hearing about all kinds of other things related to Bible prophecy, history, and archaeology, we're going to have a lot of that on this channel, so don't forget to hit like and subscribe, or just keep up with it. And I also wanted to make a point about the accuracy of Esther, or really of the Bible, in talking about the succession of rulers at this time. So if we go into Ezra 4:6, wrong page. I'm like, where is it? If we go into Ezra, actually, so Ezra chapter 4, verses probably 4 through 6, it says, Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, Xerxes. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And then the next segment, starting in verse 7, says, In the days of Artaxerxes. So we see Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. And that was established in the Bible before, of course, anything like that came out. And
also, just kind of along with the timeline of things where it's talking about all the lines of the king, it does also say earlier in the Bible where Esther falls in the timeline. So in Nehemiah, it's between chapters 6 and 7 is where the story of Esther, or so, I believe it's 6 and 7. So, you can tell me if I'm wrong. But
so if you read through Nehemiah, you'd pause kind of between 6 and 7, and
that's where Esther, the events of Esther occur.
Oh, that's really cool. And then supposedly wasn't like Nehemiah the cupbearer of one of these guys?
Yes.
That's cool. That's cool. Okay. Esther chapter 1. The king's banquets. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media, and the nobles, and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. pomp being the root word for pompous, right? 180 days, that's like 6 months. And when these days were completed, the king gave all the people present in Susa, the citadel, which was a high ground fortress where the castle was, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purpled silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, I think, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels. They found golden vessels, by the way. That's pretty cool. Vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict, quote, "There is no compulsion," end quote. And I think that was funny to me because when you read that, you're like, oh, he's not forcing people to drink. That's cool. But other words for compulsion or oppression or constraint. So it's kind of like there is no compulsion. There's also no constraint.
Go full.
If you want.
Yeah.
Cleverly. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus.
So something that's interesting about the first part and like going in with having this whole long feast of pretty much a 6-month long party, but it's in the presence of all of the nobles and the governors. Part of this is kind of a 2-part issue. Not like issue, but thing. Part of it is he recently took over reign from his father, and so he hasn't done anything yet. He just inherited the throne. He didn't have to work for it. So he's throwing this party to kind of show, like, I am still amazing. I have the power. He's trying to prove himself in front of the army.
Yeah, show his wealth and prosperity. And,
And the other side of it is a lot of times this kind of thing is performed when they're trying to rally for a war.
Were they?
Just trying to rally for a war against the Greeks as well. So that's part of the reason why.
Yeah. That's really neat. Now we're going to move on to the next portion. Queen Vashti's refusal. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he was drunk, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, I'm probably saying these wrong, but we're going to go for it anyway, Bigtha and Abaktha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Now there is debate about whether or not in her royal crown meant that was all she was wearing, or not, but just like in her glory. But either way, she was put in a very compromising position that had something to do with her honor, her integrity.
So that's the interesting thing with Queen Vashti is, so her lineage, her father was Belshazzar. He was the last ruler of Babylon before it got transferred over to the Persians.
Right. So her grandpa was...
Her grandfather was Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, so she's like, my granddaddy was Nebuchadnezzar. How dare you?
Yeah, she didn't want to just be a trophy queen. She wanted to actually...
Right. And also, like, in front of the army. Like, these are not all noble people, right? There's the army of both Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors, who are all probably drunk. Her husband's drunk. And it's definitely, like, a degrading situation to put herself in.
Especially because it wasn't, like, the standard of the time either. Women weren't supposed to be in that sort of...
They weren't supposed to show it.
Yeah.
Probably for good reason.
Yeah.
Ugh. Okay. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admantha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, Memucan, or Memucan, Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face, meaning he showed grace and favor to them. That's elsewhere in the Bible when it, in reference to God showing his face, it just means he showed grace and favor. And sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Perhaps because they were being awful. I don't know. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people.
Some people might use those last few verses in a bad light towards the Bible, but it's not, because they are technically verses in the Bible that say the man should be the master of the household.
And women need to be subservient to their husbands.
Yeah. But that's not the rule of God, that's the rule of the Persians.
In this instance.
In this instance, yeah.
Well, and not just that, but if you're actually reading through Esther, it's amazing to me how many times people will ignore all context. Mm-hmm. And just say, well, obviously the Bible is misogynistic or sexist or patriarchal. And it is patriarchal in a sense, in like the classic sense. And God does call on women to be subservient to their husbands, and their husbands to be kind and loving and care for their wives. But people do often ignore the context surrounding these moments. And so in this case, when you're reading through, it's pretty obvious that Ahasuerus, Xerxes, is being dumb, that he's acting irresponsibly, that he's putting his wife into a tricky situation. I mean, they're emphasizing the drunkenness of all these people. They're emphasizing the pomp of it all. And at no point in actually reading it does it seem to me to be condoning the actions of Ahasuerus in the first place, let alone, whether banishing her was acceptable. So I just think that's an important note, to always pay attention to context, read around, and don't just assume something. Did you have anything to say about the space between chapters 1 and 2?
So there's like slight debate between the space between. Some think it's immediate, but then there's other trains of thought that actually say that since there was that whole rallying of the army, it was, like I said, trying to go for trying to have a war with Greece, and that's where the Battle of Thermopylae occurred. So that was the whole 300 movie. Happened in between chapters 1 and 2. And so in the first verse of chapter 2, it's talking about how his anger is abating. He's known as an angry king, but he was able to win that war, so that might be why his anger.
Wasn't he like really, really, really awful human being? Yeah, he was not a good guy. He was known, and this is secularly known, that there was, at one point, he had 300 people build a like really decently big bridge, and then the ocean ended up coming up and taking out the bridge. Like, it just happened. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't build it right or whatever, but he was really angry, and he started attacking the ocean. What?
Like with a spear.
What?
Yeah.
Him personally?
Yeah. and he was
Like he
cursing
threw
the
a
ocean.
fit.
Yeah. And then he ordered all 300 of the builders beheaded.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
So he wasn't a very happy individual. So
he had anger problems, probably.
Yeah.
Wow. So Vashti was probably like, thank you. Get out of here. No. We have seen, I think this is actually a good time to just throw in. We have seen a movie that we originally thought was a really good movie about Esther. It was called The Night with the King. And it's like this really romantic, kind of whimsical take on the union between Esther and Ahasuerus. I thought it was lovely. And then you actually read it and you learn about him as a person and you learn about her experience that we're about to talk about. And you realize that that is a bad movie because of how inaccurate it is and how it romanticizes something so awful. So, anyways, moving on. Chapter 2. Esther, chosen queen. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei. I'm saying that wrong, probably. Son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women, and the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would go in to the king again, or she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission or cancellation of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity.
He really liked her.
He really liked her. I think I'll finish up real quick.
Yeah.
Mordecai discovers a plot. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred to her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged in the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right. Now we've read it. Let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Some more.
Some more.
Some more. Girl Scout cookies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now I'm hungry.
Very tasty.
There. Next time. Gotta find a Girl Scout. Okay. So first I wanted to talk about the poor fortune of Esther. Really, yeah. Honestly. So she's orphaned, number one. Trafficked, number two. There's some debate about Esther's age. A lot of people will say she was in her 40s or older. And I say that's probably not true. I say I don't think you're right. I think she was a minor or very, very young. Why do you think that, Jessica? Well, because 9 times the Bible emphasizes the young women. Listen to this. But beautiful young virgins, young, the young woman, young woman, 7 chosen young women, for each young woman. And then you get to verses 13 through 14, where she goes into the king, right? At night, and comes out in the morning, and immediately after that she's referred to as Esther. They don't refer to her as a young woman anymore, which I thought was an interesting, perhaps cultural note, is that maybe that had to do with some sort of coming of age thought, or
it might just be her
maturity.
Political standing at that point,
maybe,
since he made the decision.
Maybe. So anyway, orphan, trafficked, she's a minor. She's literally groomed for a year. Like, that's the epitome of grooming, right? Actual grooming, and prepped for this. She's stripped of her identity, her religion, and her morals because Mordecai demands that she not disclose who she is, and she probably can't really behave like a Jew. And then she's forced into sin, not only forced to not obey her religion, but like forced into to counter it by spending a night alone with the king, where we kind of assume that means that she probably had sexual relations with him. And I just kind of wanted to talk about that. This is where we start to see that theme in Esther showing up, where even so, despite these horrible things happening to her and the horrible things that we might encounter in our lives, God uses, he doesn't cause sin. He's not the source of it, but he does use it towards his purposes, for his plans, for a good thing. And I know a lot of people struggle with the idea that, like, well, how can God allow these things? And well, typically it's because it serves a greater purpose, one that you often can't see yet. Through these awful circumstances, Esther was set up to become queen, right? If one of these things hadn't happened to her, she wouldn't be in a position to become queen, and she therefore wouldn't be able to do what she later does, which we'll talk about in another video. And Mordecai also, you know, you think about it for a second. You think, okay, they're subjugated people, probably very poorly treated in comparison to Persians and whatever. And the things that he probably dealt with on a day-to-day basis, being a Jewish person, placed in a position, literally a position of authority so that he can be present in that place, but also literally positioned at the gate to overhear a plot to kill Ahasuerus. I just think it's really important that we consider the fact that, so God gives us talents, or he gives us attributes, whether it's physical beauty or some sort of character, bit of character that helps you get somewhere in life, or talents that you have, that you've developed. He gives us those to put us in a place, or give us the opportunity to enter into a field, a playing field, and become an actor in his plan. But it's always, always, always up to us to make these kind of...
Actually take the step forward.
I always like to think of it as like stepping out on the water, right? You are always required to step out on water before God will meet you. You know, and that's something that we see in like the Exodus, right? So when they're escaping from Pharaoh, he sticks his staff in the water. Okay, well, there's a lot of staff in the water moments, but I'm talking about when he splits the water and they walk through, right? So at first, all he had to do was put that staff in the water, and then God split the sea, but he had to act in faith and put that staff in the water, because that, I mean, realistically, imagine being in that position and being like, well, okay, this is crazy, but I'm going to try it anyway. And then later on, something to do with, they actually had to, I'm trying to remember what body of water they had to cross at some point in the wilderness or something, but God said at that point that they actually had to like step into the water, like start wading in the water,
actually take another further step of faith,
right? Like he never moves for you unless you are stepping out in faith in a greater way. And so I think that's an important point. One major theme that we're already seeing develop in Esther is the idea of God's sovereignty. You know, that his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts greater than our thoughts. Like all-encompassing, not just the good. I think a lot of people struggle, sometimes I struggle with accepting the fact that God's ways are in fact higher than my ways and his understanding is better than mine. And so yeah, it is common for him to use bad things for his purposes. And so wanted to go to Isaiah 46, 9 through 11. God says, "For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Okay. Isaiah 55, 8 through 9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And so it's just like that comforting idea of sovereignty. And then building from that, I think, you go from his sovereignty over it to his providence, right? Because you're like, well, what does this mean for us practically? What does his sovereignty mean? Well, it means that everything is accounted for. Okay, Ephesians chapter 1, 11 through 14. "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, so that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory. In him you also, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and believed in him, were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it, to the praise of his glory," emphasizing that predestined according to his purposes. Now we're going to go back to Romans. I want to do, we're going to do Romans 5, 3 through 5. "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." He's sovereign over a thing.
Yeah. He
over
has
everything.
He has all the power. He gives us talents. We have to choose to use the talents, but he also kind of knows what talents we're going to use. And we don't have to worry over any of the things that we're
going through,
because in the end, God still has power over it, and there's no need to be anxious over it.
Right.
Which is a lesson I think I need to learn a lot more. But
yeah. You seem so calm all the time. You're just burning on the inside. You're just. So God is sovereign. He has providence over everything. Praise in perfection is only worth so much, but praise through real turmoil and oppression and pain matters a lot more. And so it is through that that we glorify God the most.
Mm-hmm.
And it is often through that that God can work through us or in us the most.
It's the story. It's more of like an everyday person's experience of God.
Yeah, and I feel like what would it be if it did have, like it wouldn't be as good if it did have God directly interceding, because not only do you have this example of someone going through really, really tough stuff, but she's also in like a foreign place without other believers, without an influence of God. And so maybe that's part of the reason why we don't see him, is because there is no influence there. Like, well, he is sovereign and he is, you know, providence and all that. But the people there are not of God. So I don't think it would be as useful to people if it were any other way.
Yeah.
So far, that's what we've gotten from Esther, chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah. Tell us your thoughts on Esther, and join us next time for whatever other chapters we're able to cover. Probably 3 and 4. All right. Take care and God bless.